people unfortunately fall into it every time because it's easier to put the blame on them than to be able to hold our politicians to account on why we are experiencing these cost of living over long periods of time. And unfortunately, we can have this fear, but when we look at the climate crisis, we can expect that there'll be even more migrants who have to escape from places that are being degraded as we speak.
I'm your host, Soraya Chigozie, and this is Diaspora and Development, where we give voice to people of the diaspora working in international development.
My guest today is Svetlana Onye. Svetlana is a climate journalist harnessing the significance of lived experience and creativity in her work across the global south. Eco-anxiety is a unique phenomenon felt by those who are least protected from the impact of climate change. Svetlana, as one of its proponents, has spent much of her career advocating for creative expression as a key component in understanding the stories of communities in West Africa and in the global south. On the show, she'll share with us her continued efforts to support mental health, support intergenerational conversation, and the significance of environmental justice for global South communities. Thanks so much for joining us, Svetlana.
Thank you for having me.
We're happy to have you as a guest in Diaspora and Development. Quite excited. You've got a very interesting background. So let's get into it. Growing up in West London as part of the British-Nigerian diaspora, how did your cultural heritage influence your worldview and issues you advocate for today?
I think that's a really good question. So I am Igbo Nigerian. So Igbo people are an ethnic group in the southeast of Nigeria. And I think when we speak about Igbo people, they're really well known for proverbs and storytelling. For example, when we speak about the most famous Nigerian author, we speak about Chinua Achebe. I mean, now we talk about Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. So I think storytelling has always been this powerful tool that I've known that has been a part of my culture. And so being a storyteller myself has been a natural development. And I think that also with being Nigerian, I learned very early on about Ken Saro. So he was an environmentalist and a writer who wanted to protect his land and the Ogoni people from the impact of Shell and what oil was doing to the environment. And unfortunately, the Nigerian government ended up killing him and some of his comrades. But being able and understanding the power of storytelling and understanding these great giants such as Ken Saro really influenced my need to be a storyteller myself, but also to engage in activism and advocacy for people.
Interesting. So it's in your blood, Chinua Achebe and Ngozi Adichie, which I actually just saw speak a couple of days ago.
Oh, wow.
So these people, they're poetic. And
Yeah.
I remember reading Things Fall Apart, and I was like, it was so far left from what I had read before, but very profound. So it's in your blood. Interesting.
Exactly.
Were there any key moments or role models in your early years that inspired you to pursue activism and journalism, apart from the people you've mentioned?
Yeah, so I think for my parents who came to UK from Nigeria, I think seeing them adapt to a foreign land and seeing the way that they were treated, experiencing racism from our neighbors, for example, and different situations like that made me learn very early on that in this life there are some people who are subjugated or who looked down upon for reasons that are not to do with who they are as people, but rather the color of their skin, maybe, or the circumstances that mean that they have to move from their home into somewhere else. And I think growing up in that environment and recognizing very early on what I believe was wrong from right meant that I wanted to speak up against that and make sure that people who are marginalized actually are able to advocate for themselves. Because often, even now in the UK, where there's heavy discussions about immigrants and an influx of people entering the country, people don't do that. People don't leave what is comforting to them by choice.
Mm-hmm.
And often there's geopolitics involved that means that people move from that safe space into a foreign place. And I think that's important for me to, especially because of my background, advocate for people who are often not given the opportunity to have a voice.
Given the many years of immigration in the UK, perhaps the most influx in the 50s and 60s, it's still a big issue. Still a big discussion. Does it come in wave or is it always a continuous conversation?
Yeah, I think Unfortunately, it can be used as a tool for political parties to gain voters. I think, especially when there's periods of high costs of living, what everyday people are fearful for is lack of security. How am I going to have employment? How am I going to feed my family? How am I going to actualize myself in society? And I think that often when political leaders are trying to get voters, they recognize that they can play on this by saying that there are a group of people who are a threat to your security. And oftentimes they use immigrants as a perfect example. So recently, with the elections, that was the big thing of closing the borders. How are we going to deal with this influx of people who are threatening the British identity, but also the security of that identity? People unfortunately fall into it every time because it's easier to put the blame on them than to be able to hold our politicians to account on why we are experiencing these cost of living over long periods of time. And unfortunately, we can have this fear, but when we look at the climate crisis, we can expect that there'll be even more migrants who have to escape from places that are being degraded as we speak. It's a cycle that we as the public fall into, but also politicians exploit.
And when they talk about British identity, you're still, as a population from the diaspora, still being othered. You're still not part of the British identity.
Exactly, and I think as a diaspora, that can be a difficult identity to have because, for example, you might go to your home country where your parents are from and you have a British accent, you don't
Hmm.
know the language. So even there, you recognize straight away that you're not home. Then you come to where you are born, and people are saying, but where are you really from? And why do you dress like that or look like that or have hair like a particular type of way? It's this idea that you don't belong anywhere.
Mm.
Um, and you have to just accept that, which can be difficult.
It can be difficult. I call it a hybrid culture or hybrids.
Yeah,
I'm not this and I'm not that.
exactly.
Gives us a superpower, I think.
I 100% agree with you.
You
Yes.
have a strong creative background. Was writing, music, or storytelling always part of your life growing up? You mentioned your background and how Ngozi Adichie and Chinua Achebe always were part of your influences. But were you writing and singing or interested in this since your youth?
Yeah, because my parents came here and they didn't really have a lot, they were always working. So fortunately, we lived next to a library, so they'd often take us there and like rest between jobs. And I think that was the first time where I discovered a book and realized that actually in this story, I'm not Svetlana, I'm not this character. And it allowed me to dream. And I think that learning how to engage in these books then allowed me to write myself because I wanted to replicate these stories. I'm the only family member that likes to sing and do music, but I think that engaging with the library in that way was a pivotal moment for me. My parents, before they came here, my dad was a journalist in Nigeria, and when he and my mum were growing up together, they did do things like write theatre plays and engage in that. But unfortunately, because there wasn't enough resources and they eventually came to the UK, all of that creativity sort of simmered away. So it's definitely because of books, I think that I am
Mm.
the way that I am,
Didn't
which I
simmer
don't.
away. It went into you. It didn't simmer
Yeah,
away. It was there.
that's a beautiful way to say. Yeah, yeah, I agree.
What was your first experience with climate activism and how did it shape your approach to advocacy?
When I was 18, I was studying journalism and we had to do an original story. So I went to, at the time, it was a community called Grow Heathrow. So they were planning to do a third runway, and this community were essentially squatting there to try to say that you shouldn't do that, it's going to destroy biodiversity and the community, etc. So I went there and I interviewed the people that were living there. I was really inspired because there was people from the UK, from Russia, from France, from all around the world. And one woman in particular sat with me and she was just talking about her connection to this land and how she was using it to cultivate fresh food and how they were living together as a community and how all of that would basically dissipate once they decide to do that third runway. So I think that was the first time where I was actively speaking to people, engaging in activism in a different way in terms of building community and growing in their own food. And I realized that it's really important because when we decide to do this third runway, for example, we're destroying a connection that humans have naturally to land. Like, as we get socialized into different things, we sort of get distracted from. And that was my first time really understanding this is something I want to understand a bit more.
In Montreal, we have two airports, and there was one called Mirabel. It still exists, but it was supposed to be a
Mm.
second airport to kind of divert some of the air traffic to that area. And it touched a lot of farmland in that area. And I don't recall, because I'm not sure if I was born or if I was too young, the direct stories, but I recall hearing it all the time because as a professional, I work on impact assessments and how our programs can affect people. And one of the things I remember is that, a lot of farmland was touched. And it's interesting because that airport is now not very much used. And I think sometimes all of the loss and all of the
Yeah,
stories, and I wonder what the generations after feel. But did they build the extra runway?
yeah. So the Great Heathrow doesn't exist anymore. They've unfortunately been forcibly evicted. So I think they are making those plans and they're still trying to understand how best to do it. But it's confirmed that they do want to
They
do
did.
that. Yeah.
Can you explain what eco anxiety is and how uniquely it affects the communities you work with?
Yeah. So eco-anxiety, when we speak about that, we normally, especially in the global north, talk about it as this mental, emotional reaction to the climate crisis, whether it is experiencing it or knowing that it exists, and that often is fear or doom for the future. But I work primarily with communities in the global south where it's a bit different. So we often use the term environmental related emotions because communities in the global south are experiencing the brunt of the climate crisis now with climate events, which can be hurricanes, droughts, floods, things like that. So they're experiencing those fatalities now. And simultaneously, they're also experiencing the inability to recover from that because of political instability, electricity, poverty, different things like that. So when we speak to young people who are experiencing eco-anxiety in Nigeria, for example, it can be PTSD, it can be grief, it can be anger, it can be frustration, and that fear of knowing that if this is what's happening now, and we know that researchers are telling us that these climate events are going to continue, but at a worse rate, then what exactly will happen to us in our future?
So, worried about the future, worsening climate, do you discuss things with them or what do you do to help them cope with this?
So I lead something called the Eco Anxiety Africa Project. So that was founded in 2022. And what we do is we build research and projects and initiatives to promote resilience in communities. For example, when we do our Zen Cafe sessions in Lagos, we bring young people together and we speak about eco anxiety and we let them speak of their experiences because oftentimes when you use the term anxiety, it can be related to mental illness. And in a community where there's a taboo, it means that people can feel things, but they don't want to speak about it. So we give them that community and then we introduce coping mechanisms, whether that's breathing exercises or whether it's journaling and things like that. But also we're doing more extended projects. So we're about to do intergenerational dialogues in Abia, Abuja, and Lagos, where elders and youth will come together to speak about eco-anxiety, exchange wisdom, but also do a sustainable collaborative project together. It's trying to give people that capacity building to have resilience as these climate events continue to take place.
Oh, that sounds amazing, especially the intergenerational discussion. I think that's going to be quite profound. We
Yeah,
often think we have different problems from our elders, and when you dig deep,
exactly.
you're about to have an upcoming documentary on eco anxiety.
Yeah,
Tell us about it.
it will be about the Eco Anxiety Africa project. So essentially, we've been interviewing African youth from different parts of the continent. And we just want to amplify these stories to show that there is a prevalence of eco anxiety on the continent, and also speaking to subject matter experts to emphasize that point with data and analysis of what's happening and the linkages to climate events and the situation in these countries. And we're also showing our work, so how we engage with youth to give them that resilience and to help those communities, and how we do that through different facets, through research that we hope will influence policy, but also through those community projects that can give people that independent skills to take what they've learned and give it to their community. So hopefully through that documentary, we will have this inclusion of African voices when we talk about this phenomenon of eco-anxiety, rather than just understand what it is in the global north perspective, which is a fear of what's to come, when that's not the case for millions of people in a different part of the world.
You emphasize storytelling in your advocacy. Why do you believe creative expression is such a powerful tool for climate activism?
Yeah, I think that storytelling is soft power. We engage with stories all the time, whether it's the lyrics or the music that we listen to, or even the style that certain news publications use that influence how we see the world, and movies. So I think that if we see that there's like dictatorships and things like that. And the first thing that they try to sort of manipulate is stories and things like that, then it only shows us that it's really powerful tool. I think that we can use the stories of people who are impacted by the climate to build that understanding of this is what's happening. And these people, they're no different to us, that they're experiencing these things. And actually, how can I help? Or how can I use what's happening to understand what is to come? So I think it's a really powerful tool, even when we're talking about engaging people who don't believe in the climate crisis or people who have been hearing it so much that now they're apathetic. So I think storytelling should be used as a way to inject life into climate activism and also to engage as much communities as possible.
Do you think these stories can create real policy change?
Yes, I think if we embed stories into research, that can happen. So, for example, when we create research for the Eco Anxiety Africa project, we can't prove our point without including the lived experience of youth. And we're only going to get that by going to them and telling them why their story, their life is important. And I think when we embed those stories into research and we work out how to use stories as a data tool, then that in itself can prove to politicians and prove to policymakers that something needs to be done. And I think if we don't have those stories, then we're not able to prove that in the way that we can.
A lot of times when we're talking about climate activism, we have a few symbolic people, usually from the North or the Western world, and not a lot of voices from the global South. What challenges have you encountered when trying to center marginalized voices to climate justice conversations?
Yeah, even when I think about working with like particular research institutions, but also when you enter the international climate policy space like COP, these institutions have been around for a number of years and they're used to a type of voice and they're used to a type of education and a type of location that they allow individuals to speak from. And often those individuals look and sound a type of way. I think that's why when we talk about decolonization, it's like recognizing that those thoughts are influenced by colonial mentalities. So often the challenge is that when you do try to bring new voices into that space, the decision makers already have this idea of what that voice is going to say or how intellectual that voice will be in comparison to what they're used to. And it's about challenging that and creating and making people realize that if you are in that echo chamber, the idea of just transition or climate justice will never be true because you're only going to create decisions that benefit one part of the world. A big example of how we saw it was in COP29, where countries from particular in the global south were not always in particular conversations, or even after the decision about the climate finance doesn't speak to what's actually the reality on the ground in the global south. But unfortunately, we have to keep challenging that if we actually want to create sustained change for everyone in the world.
Thank you. It's interesting. I think a lot of people don't know how COP works, and a
Yeah.
lot of United Nations. I used to participate in the CSW every year. It's the women-led organizations meet, etc. And a lot of civil society participates in what's called side meetings. So it's hard to have direct conversation with the real decision. A lot of times, people are invited to look,
Yep.
but I didn't realize COP was the same way, where you're on the side, but the influence to change policy is quite difficult.
Yeah, so at COP, if you come with the government, you have a party badge, which means you can enter negotiations about policy. But a lot of the time, civil society comes with an observer badge, which means you can't even enter those rooms. And you are literally spectating and hoping that the decisions that are spoken about at the closing plenary reflects what you feel needs to happen on the ground. And oftentimes that's not the case, which is why there was such an uproar with the recent COP. And again, this is an institution that's existed for years in a particular type of way. And even though a lot of mechanisms they employ does not work, it doesn't always mean that the change is actually happening, which is why we see fossil fuel lobbyists attending COP, which is why we see particular groups of people having more of a voice than others. And it's unfortunate, but we can only hope that it will eventually change to serve everyone if we're really going to deal with this climate crisis.
On that same theme, the global south only contributes to about 4% of global emissions, yet suffers disproportionately from climate change. How do we reframe global climate conversations to reflect this reality? Is there another way besides COP?
Yeah, for me, it's like, for example, if there was a meeting where, let's say, the UK was speaking to Nigeria about energy transition or how we're going to do climate finance or anything like that, it's understanding that it's not only about the two political leaders being in that space. It's also about bringing the actual people in the community who are experiencing the daily realities of the climate crisis. That to me is what it means to bring the right voices into the room. Because even when we speak about political leaders in the global south, especially if I speak about Nigeria, they live in a particular privilege that doesn't reflect what everyday Nigerians are experiencing. And I think it's about if you are going to bring people from the community into that room to show you what they are doing to adapt and what they need to continue their adaptation, then it's also about that capacity building. So working with them to understand how to navigate that space, how to speak their mind, but also making sure that if there's going to be translators, for example, to make sure that those conversations are rich and inclusive. That's what it means to bring marginalized voices, is making sure that people in the community living the everyday are actually having a voice at the table to influence decisions.
And on that same vein, you're working on creating an institutional youth climate council for the UK government. What impact do you hope this will have, and how will this council be composed?
Yeah, so I'm part of the UK Youth Climate Coalition. So we are trying to work with the government to see how can we improve youth inclusion in domestic policy making, especially when it comes to climate policy. And I think there's a lot of countries that do have a youth climate council, even in Nigeria, for example. In the case of the UK, when we now have a Labour government and they're focused on net zero strategy and making sure that there's more green jobs, that's also, you have to speak to youth about how are you going to upskill youth to be able to take those green jobs that will be pivotal to that just energy transition. Also, how are you going to influence education to make sure that you feel like they are supposed to be involved in this complex topic of climate and that there is a space for them to have professions that deal with climate? And the only way you're going to understand how best to do that is through engaging youth and creating a clear pathway for that to happen. There's so many youth groups that are dealing with different things, different issues in the UK, but it's quite fragmented. So a youth climate council would be able to bring all of that together to create a healthy stream to communicate to the government, to feed into climate policy, but also to collect youth needs from the ground. It would definitely be a game changer. And I think that the government are trying to engage with youth, but they're also trying to understand just how to do that. That's an example of how that can be possible.
But they're open to it.
I think they are open to it over time. Yeah.
Among the many things you do, you also founded Not Actually Radical. I love the title. I'd like to find out a little bit more about it. It's an educational platform aimed at empowering the diasporic community. What inspires this initiative, and how does it contribute to unlearning and imagining new futures?
Yeah, so I created Not Actually Radical because I was doing a master's and we had to pay for that, and it's a lot of money. And then you're sitting there and you're studying the politics of conflict, rights, and justice, and you're understanding all these heavy theories. And for me, it made me realize that, okay, this education can help people to understand change, but then I've had to pay X amount to get it. It doesn't seem fair. So I think creating Not Actually Radical was my way of understanding the power of education, but the power of accessible education, and that these theories can be broken down to be understood by someone who hasn't had a master's, and they should be able to access it. And I think that when you have that education and when you have that access to even different novels that promote change, like Octavia Butler, then you can have that space to dream and to imagine and to believe that things can be different. So that's why I created it. And the term Not Actually Radical is basically, I think sometimes when people do try to propagate for change, they are given the term of being a radical. And when I look at the state of the world, it shouldn't be a radical concept to want people to live comfortable lives, to live fruitful lives, to not suffer, to have access to basic human necessities. So that's why I named it Not Actually Radical.
Thank you. You're also a singer. You released
Mhm.
an album, I believe, last year.
Yeah,
Can you tell us about it? And does that have anything to do, or are they two separate things, with your environmental advocacy?
yeah. So I released Rage. I think it was for me this idea that as a woman who's been through like difficult relationships where I've experienced difficult things, you're left with really heavy emotions and a lot of anger. But I think that can be turned into art that gives that peace and healing. With the music that I create, what's important for me is to write songs that speak the truth of the human experience. I think there's a lot of love songs, and we know that human beings experience love, but sometimes we also experience regret or feeling like shame because maybe we don't live up to our parents' expectations and different things like that. And I want to create music that speaks to that and makes us realize it's kind of like that James Baldwin quote that when you read, you realize that you're not alone in the world anymore. And I think music can do the same thing. And I hope that with that project, I was able to do that same thing.
Super. What's the title of your album?
Rage.
Yeah, that's good. Good title.
Thank you.
If there was a key message you'd like listeners to take away about climate activism in the global south, what would it be?
I think it would be that there are so many incredible people in the global south, activists, environmentalists, youth groups that are really doing what they can with the little they have to create change. And they've understood their community, taken the time to understand their community, and are helping them to build things to adapt to this crisis that we're experiencing. And what they need is not to have people necessarily speak for them, but to be amplified and to be brought into the right spaces to continue their work. I think they need more funding, especially when it comes to the Eco Anxiety Africa project. It's youth-led, and it needs more funding to increase the scale of the impact that we're doing. And I think that a lot of organizations, even civil society in the global north, can learn from what activists in the global south are doing. Unfortunately, the thing about living in a globalized world is if something is happening in the global south, eventually it will come to the global north. So instead of thinking about it in a separate way of this happened to them and we should get used to that and X, Y, and Z, actually, what can we learn from them to prepare for what is to come, but also to bring a collective, joined, safe world?
Thank you.
Join us every first Tuesday of the month. Don't forget to like us, follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and find us on Instagram and on our website if you'd like to be featured as a guest or have any recommendations for guests. We look forward to hearing from you.